Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We're delighted that you could join us today. My name is Judy Moore. I'm a senior policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development, where we do independent research for global development. And excited today, actually, to have Brad Parks here to speak about his new book, Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program. Robert Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank, describes this book as path-breaking, and Steve Rattlet, a mentor and former chief economist of USAID, has called it unquestionably the finest available on China's overseas development program. Brad is the executive director of ADA at the College of William and Mary, where he leads a team who work with which works with governments and international organizations to improve the ways in which overseas investments are targeted, monitored, and evaluated. He's also a non-resident fellow here at the Center for Global Development. I should point that out. But this event, this book, this work, it just comes a full circle, because this work stream first was launched here at CGD with a working paper, China's Development Finance to Africa, and an event back in 2013. So it makes sense that we should host this talk here at CGD today, almost a decade after this. So first, we're going to turn over to Brad. He's going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to go into questions and answers. And after that, we're going to invite the audience in to have a conversation with Brad and asking questions for what he's doing. So without much ado, I will now turn over to Brad.
Thanks, Jide. It's really exciting to be here with you. Thanks to everyone tuning in. Just honored to have this opportunity to speak with you. So this new book, Banking on Beijing, is really all about better understanding China's overseas development program. And we try to answer three big questions. The first is, how is it that China transformed itself in the space of a generation from a net recipient to a dominant provider of international development finance? Second, why does Beijing provide aid and credit to other countries? What are the motivational factors behind its aid program and its lending program? And third, how effective are these projects? Who benefits the most and the least? And if these projects have negative unintended impacts, how can host countries more effectively manage and mitigate those risks? The existing debate about China's overseas lending and grant-giving activities is for the most part based on opinion and conjecture, or research that doesn't rest on a particularly strong evidentiary foundation. So my co-authors and I, we consider ourselves to be kind of dyed-in-the-wool empiricists. So what we try to do in the book is take the conventional wisdom about China's overseas development program and expose it to scrutiny, to empirical scrutiny. You know, policymakers and journalists in Washington and London and Brussels, they often assume Beijing is using aid, for example, to prop up rogue regimes, or it's using debt to ensnare and subordinate foreign governments. And so we try to put these assumptions to the test by measuring whether China allocates international aid and credit any differently than its Western peers and competitors. You know, we also try to take a closer look at the claim that China bankrolls white elephants, right? A common criticism is that Beijing prioritizes speed over quality, and its development projects deliver inferior economic returns. So we measured the economic impacts of Chinese development projects, and then we benchmarked them against the economic impacts of development projects financed by OECD DAC donors and multilateral institutions. And you know, up until this point, no one has really been able to answer these questions convincingly, because Beijing shrouds its overseas development program in secrecy. It doesn't voluntarily disclose information about its aid projects through international reporting systems like the OECD's creditor reporting system, nor does it publish detailed information about its commercial lending activities. It also uses stringent confidentiality requirements to shield its lending and grant-giving activities from public view. So, you know, I guess a way to think about it is a first order goal of the book was to build a stronger evidentiary foundation for analysis of both the aims and the impacts of China's overseas development program. I should say that the book is the result of a 10-year collaboration between a group of economists and political scientists in Germany, Hong Kong, and the US. So my co-authors, Axel Dreher, Andreas Fuchs, Austin Strange, and Mike Tierney, they are based at the University of Hong Kong, Heidelberg University, the University of Göttingen, and William and Mary. And when the five of us were initially trying to get a handle on the scale and the scope and the composition of China's overseas development program, we decided to first go directly to the authorities in Beijing and ask them if they'd be willing to share detailed and comprehensive information about their overseas lending and grant giving program. And they were very polite, but they told us that the information we were seeking was a state secret. And when we asked them why they didn't want the world to know more about the work that they were funding overseas, one senior Chinese government official came back to us and said, look, everybody who needs to know about our generosity already knows. So after that interaction, we started poking around to see what sources of information were already in the public domain. And to our surprise, we discovered there's actually a vast treasure trove of information about Chinese government financed development projects that's already in the public domain. The problem is that the information is highly decentralized. It's spread across hundreds of thousands of sources in more than a dozen languages. You know, you can retrieve official data on China's lending and grant giving activities from the aid and debt information management systems of finance ministries in host countries. You can find unredacted grant and loan, debt cancellation and debt rescheduling contracts in government registers and gazettes. You can find tons of information, financial information, locational information, operational details about Chinese development projects on Chinese embassy websites or in annual reports from Chinese state-owned banks and enterprises, or reports published by auditor generals and other parliamentary oversight institutions. The problem is not a lack of information. The problem is it's not centralized, right? It's spread out. So in this, about 10 years ago, in the summer of 2012, my colleague and co-author, Austin Strange, he led this exercise at William and Mary with a team of 12 research assistants to develop a new method of data collection, which we call tracking underreported financial flows, or TUF for short. And that methodology involves standardizing and synthesizing all these fragmented bits of information sort of spread across thousands and thousands of different sources. And then Axel and Andreas and Mike and I, we worked with Austin to figure out if the methodology was sufficiently robust to generate comprehensive and detailed information about Chinese government funded projects in just one region of the world. And that at the time was Africa. So then, as you mentioned, Jide, we published our initial results in a 2013 CGD working paper. Then the methodology went through years and years of peer review and refinement. We re-engineered the methodology to make it more reliant on official sources. And we eventually used a substantially improved version of the methodology to capture official sector financial flows from China to all major world regions, including every single low-income and middle-income country in the world. So, that's the backstory on how this came into being. I should say that this decade-long data collection exercise, it required a small army, including more than 150 research assistants at William and Mary and 10 full-time professional staff at AidData. And it really would not have been possible without their sweat equity.
We've been doing a Zoom for a long time, and you still end up being muted when you try to speak. But thank you very much for that, Brad. In fact, it went into the first question I was going to ask, which was, why did this book need to be written? What gap does it fill? But is this centralizing information about China's development program or lending and debt program, but also in a systematic way that can withstand, scrutiny, rigorous scrutiny. So just before we go into further questions, if you have any not you, Brad, but our audience, if you have questions for our panelists for Brad, please submit them via, you can send them by email, events@cgdev.org, or you can tweet at cgdev.org, or we have a hashtag on Twitter, is hashtag CGD Talks, or you can just send your comments via YouTube, and we'll try to send them over to Brad so that he can answer them. I guess what we try to do with this conversation, to be able to at least grasp the book, what the book intends to do, is by focusing our conversation around scale, scope, and composition of China's lending and aid. Then within each of these areas, we sort of try to establish if there are similarities and differences between the Chinese approach and that of OECD countries. So I want to begin with scale, because China is the largest official creditor. And there are years when it's reported that Chinese lending and aid combined exceeds those of other IFIs. So what is the scale? How big is it, especially compared to the OECD and the multilateral system? At least in your research, how big is this that we're talking about, scale?
Yeah, so I think it's important to sort of answer that question before and after the introduction of the Belt and Road Initiative. So before the introduction of the BRI, China had a very substantial overseas lending and grant giving program that kind of rivaled that of the US, but everything changed with the introduction of the BRI. So since launching the BRI in late 2013, Beijing has outspent Washington on a more than 2-to-1 basis. It's outspent Brussels on a more than 4-to-1 basis, and it's outspent London on a more than 8-to-1 basis. Goodness. So in an average year during the BRI era, China is spending about $85 billion on overseas development projects. So as a point of comparison, the US spends less than half of that amount, about $37 billion a year. As a different point of reference, World Bank lending volumes, if you kind of aggregate all the money going through the IDA window and the IBRD window, together that number fluctuates between about $40 billion and $60 billion in any given year. We've also found that, when you're trying to get your head around this question of scale, it's also important to understand that Beijing is really differentiating itself from its peers and its competitors by financing very big ticket projects that virtually no one else is willing to bankroll. So they're financing for these kind of, you can think of them as mega projects, which we define as projects supported by loans worth $500 million or more. Those projects have tripled in number during the Belt and Road era. And many of these big ticket projects, they're being financed via syndicated loans rather than bilateral loans from a single lender. So these are cases where you have 5 or 10 or 15 Chinese state-owned banks that are coming together and pooling their funds to support a single infrastructure project. So syndication is, it's basically a risk-sharing mechanism that makes it easier to take on these big projects. Yeah, exactly. So in our data set that we use in the book, the average face value of a syndicated Chinese loan is $1.3 billion. So we're talking about huge projects that in most cases, the US and the EU and the World Bank, they are not willing or able to fund. In a sense, China has kind of become the go-to financier for infrastructure projects that cost hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And for better or worse, their bilateral and multilateral peers and competitors, US, EU, World Bank, they're financing more modestly sized projects that cost tens of millions of dollars. And I often tell people, it's sort of put this in to put these changes in the international development finance market into perspective. At the end of the 20th century, China's overseas development budget, it was about on par with that of a Scandinavian donor country like Denmark, pretty modest, right? And even as of 2006, China was still a net recipient of international aid, right? So now fast forward 15 years later, and China is the single largest source of international development finance in the world. I mean, it's sort of a modern marvel when you think about it.
This is actually incredible. I in my talks, I would say, especially with a focus on Africa, that there is no like for like replacement for China in terms of what China does in terms of its risk appetite when it comes to large ticket items. But this is incredible. So China is not simply the lender of first resort for low and middle income countries when it comes to infrastructure in general, as you argue in the book, but you're saying that when it comes to mega projects for $500 million and above, China is also the #1 financier when it comes to that.
That's right, and their support for those projects is going up very quickly.
This is Brad. This is incredible. Thank you. So this is a scale, right? And compared to its OECD and other bilateral, it's almost as if China is in the league by itself, right? But which brings us, into the second question on this is scope. What do they finance? What does it cover? And I know that at least here in Washington, a big portion, and then because I was in a government in Liberia, a huge portion of our development outside of infrastructure, I'm talking health systems, education systems, significant amount of that was paid for by the US government and its partners, OECD members. So when we talk about the composition of Chinese lending, this massive amounts of money that we're talking about, what's in there? What are they financing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, at the foundation of this book was the construction of a data set that was meant to capture the full scope of all official sector financial flows from China to low income and middle income countries. And that data set consists of just over 13,400 projects spread across 165 countries. If you add up the value of those financial commitments, it's $843 billion. These are projects that were approved between 2000 and 2017 and implemented between 2000 and 2021. And the data set is unique in that it captures any project that has benefited from a financial transfer or an in-kind transfer from any official sector institution in China. So that includes 334 official sector donors and lenders. We're talking about central government agencies, regional and local government agencies, state-owned policy banks like CDB and China Exim Bank, state-owned commercial banks like ICBC and Bank of China, state-owned funds. We're talking about even lending directly from state-owned enterprises or from the country's central bank, the People's Bank of China. So, a lot of policymakers and journalists, even think tank researchers, kind of fixate on the lending activities of the policy banks, China Exim Bank and CDB. And it is true, they did a lot of heavy lifting in the run-up to the BRI. However, the data set that we constructed for this book, it shows that since the BRI was introduced in 2013, it's actually the country's state-owned commercial banks, the Bank of China, ICBC, China Construction Bank, and many others that are playing an increasingly important role. Their overseas lending activities increased fivefold during the first 5 years of BRI implementation. The other thing is just about kind of sectoral scope and geographical scope. So, the data set that we've assembled, it covers all sectors. It also covers every low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income country in every major world region. And there are other Chinese development finance data sets in the public domain. There's ones that are maintained by Boston University, by Inter-American Dialogue, and others. But all of them are specific to a sector or a region or one kind of small subset of Chinese lenders, like the policy banks, China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. I think to the best of our knowledge, the data set that we put together for this book, and AidData is going to continue to update that data set going forward. We believe it to be the most comprehensive and detailed data set on China's overseas development program that currently exists.
So this is everything. This is I guess if you were to sort of apportion by proportion to say how much of it is say infrastructure, how much of it is in agriculture. There's an audience question, in fact, about if there's a history of funding for agricultural research in this. Which sector would you say takes the lion's share of that? Close to 1 trillion. I mean, it's $800 billion that we're talking about here over 2 decades.
Yeah, so like 75% of the money is concentrated in 2 sectors, the power sector and transport infrastructure. And in terms of change over time, the fastest growing sector is the power sector. So that's where the lion's share of the money is being spent. That's not to say that China's not very active in other sectors. They are. If you just look at the sectoral distribution, not by dollars, but by numbers of projects, then it looks like, okay, China is very engaged in the agricultural sector, the water sector, et cetera. But by dollar value, it's really transport infrastructure and electricity generation and transmission that are kind of soaking up the lion's share of the funding.
It appears to me, I mean, just like reading the book, it appears to me that of all of the bilateral lenders, the Chinese seem to be more directly responding to this massive need for infrastructure. Right? I think in Africa, if we took out Chinese lending to Angola, more than 70% of Chinese lending on the continent has gone to some form of infrastructure, right? And so there's this big infrastructure push here. But this is fascinating. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and in fact, what we're going to do is after this question, I'm going to start to go to the audience because we want to get the audience involved as much as possible. But so, Brad, I want us to talk about why, because like you said, both policymakers and think tankers, people ascribe all kinds of motivations to the Chinese. Why do they give aid and credit? What are the different motivations? In fact, this whole thing about debt trap diplomacy, about China intentionally attempting to ensnare its partners in these, it comes from that as part of this motivation, that there is some sort of insidious motivation where China wants to capture flagship infrastructure in the countries where it lends. Why does China do what China does?
Yeah, I'll answer that in just a moment. I think before answering that, it's important to sort of bring everyone to a common baseline. And sure. I think, one of the things that we do in the book is we use OECD DAC definitions and measurement criteria to categorize each of those 13,400 projects as either official development assistance or aid in the traditional sense of the term, or other official flows or OOF, right? So ODA is that internationally accepted way of measuring development aid, and OOF captures loans and export credits from government institutions that are priced at or near market rates. So we're talking about non-concessional and semi-concessional debt. And those categorizations, ODA and OOF, are based on 2 criteria. The concessionality level of the financing is the first one, and the primary purpose of the project. So projects must have a grant element of at least 25% to qualify as ODA, and any project with an explicit export promotion purpose is categorized as OOF. Yes. So those determinations are crucial because they are what allow us to make apples to apples comparisons. And so as shorthand, I'm going to use the term aid to refer to ODA, and I'm going to use the term debt to refer to OOF. All right. And here's what the data tell us about the composition of Chinese development finance. First off, Beijing behaves a lot more like a banker than a benefactor. So for every dollar of aid that it provides to low-income and middle-income countries, it provides $9 of debt. The U.S., by contrast, finances nearly its entire overseas development program with ODA or with the aid. Also, over time, Beijing and Washington, they're moving in diametrically opposed directions. right? So Beijing has dramatically ramped up its overseas lending program, so much so that it's now the largest official creditor in the world, larger than the World Bank, the IMF, and all Paris Club creditors combined. But its foreign aid program hasn't really increased very much over the last 2 decades. It fluctuates between around $5 billion and $8 billion a year. US government, opposite direction, right? Washington has ratcheted down its overseas lending to extremely low levels. 95% of US development finance is now provided via aid. And it's a very similar story for the other members of the OECD DAC. They've reined in their lending and they've ramped up their grant giving. And our data set also shows that Beijing's lending is provided on substantially less generous terms than the loans that are still issued by the OECD DAC and the multilateral creditors. So just so people know who are tuning in, nowadays a typical loan from China has a 4.2% interest rate and a repayment period of less than 10 years. Typical loan from an OECD DAC lender like Germany or France or Japan carries about a 1.1% interest rate and a repayment period of 28 years. And if you're wondering, okay, so we've got aid, we've got debt, where's all this money going? Most of the aid from China is going to just 2 regions. 80% of it is going to Africa and Asia in roughly equal proportion. The other 90% of their overseas development program is financed with debt. And that's pretty evenly split across Asia, Eastern and Central Europe, Latin America, and Africa. And it's interesting when you look at who are the biggest recipients of Chinese aid versus who are the biggest recipients of Chinese debt, because there's very little overlap between the 2 lists. So China's biggest borrowers, Chinese debt are Russia, Venezuela, Angola, Kazakhstan. And these countries are not big recipients of Chinese aid. The big recipients of Chinese aid are North Korea, Cuba, Burma, right? They're among the biggest. And I think the reason why there's so little overlap between these lists is that China's trying to achieve a very different set of objectives with its lending program and its aid program. So on the aid side of the ledger, it uses aid to implement the One China policy. Countries that recognize Taiwan, they're automatically ineligible for Chinese aid. It also uses aid to buy votes in the UN General Assembly. So to give you a sense of how this works, in Africa, we find that if an African country increases the alignment of its voting with China in the UN General Assembly by just 10%, it can reasonably expect to increase the amount of Chinese aid that it receives by 86% on average, right? And I think that helps explain why so many of these Chinese aid projects, what are they supporting? They're supporting presidential palaces, parliamentary complexes, convention centers in major urban areas. These are projects that are designed to cater to the interests of governing elites. China's using aid to win foreign policy concessions from politicians, right, in recipient countries. And I think it's important to say China is not unique in this regard. DAC donors played the same foreign policy game. There's decades of statistical research that demonstrates they give substantially more aid to countries that adopt their preferred foreign policy positions, whether it's in the UN General Assembly or in the UN Security Council. However, when you look at the debt side of the ledger, when Beijing finances projects with non-concessional or semi-concessional debt, these foreign policy considerations really don't matter very much. When Chinese state-owned banks issue loans or export credits that are priced close to market rates, they actually favor bankable projects, revenue-generating projects like oil refineries and steel mills and toll roads that can actually turn a profit and facilitate debt repayment. So I like to say, Chinese state-owned lenders are kind of like yield maximizing surrogates of the state. They're scouring the globe for profitable revenue-generating projects, and that focus on commercial profitability, that's why Beijing's lending is provided on less concessional terms than loans from OECD DAC and multilateral creditors. I mean, bottom line is Chinese lenders, they want to be repaid on time, they want to be repaid with interest, and they want to be repaid on a first priority basis. And this is also an area where you see a pretty significant difference between China and its bilateral and multilateral peers. I mean, if you just look at the 50 largest loans in our data set that Beijing issued for overseas development projects, they're all worth more than $2 billion. 40 of those 50 are underpinned by a source of collateral that a Chinese state-owned bank can seize in the event of default, right? So that practice of collateralizing debt, it's not very common among China's bilateral and multilateral peers. And I think it reflects the fact that China's got more exposure than any other official creditor. And so it wants to position itself at the front of the repayment line. And, I think if we're talking about motivations, like I should probably say just a few quick words about the BRI. I mean, the media likes to talk about the BRI as though it's some sort of grand strategy for building alliances and projecting influence and reshaping the international balance of power. But what we actually find in the book is that it's essentially a strategy for managing structural economic problems inside China, right? So to be more specific about this, they're using their overseas lending program to address three long-term domestic challenges. The first is they've got an oversupply of foreign currency. The second is they have high levels of industrial overproduction. And the third is that they need to secure natural resources that the country lacks in sufficient quantities at home to continue to fuel their own domestic economic growth. So what they've done is, in a way, ingenious, right? They've done three things. They've dramatically ramped up dollar-denominated lending at or near market rates because they have a surplus of dollars. They've contractually obligated their overseas borrowers to source the inputs for these infrastructure projects like steel and iron and cement and glass and aluminum. It's all coming from China, and it's coming from state-owned enterprises in China that don't have enough domestic customers that want to buy these inputs. And then the third thing that they've done is they're allowing countries to secure and repay the loans with the money that they earn from natural resource exports to China. So, in a sense, like when Belt and Road borrowers agree to buy China's oversupplied industrial inputs and they agree to absorb their surplus dollars, what are they doing? They're effectively helping Beijing manage its own domestic economic problems. And when they accept loans that are collateralized against future natural resource export receipts, what are they doing? They're helping fuel China's continued economic growth, right? So I think that kind of puts the BRI and its motivations, its underlying motivations in a different perspective. It becomes less of about a foreign policy goal and more about solving internal problems.
This is incredible, and again, just thank you for saying this. I say this to my students that one of the drivers, a key driver of a country's behavior in an international system is domestic politics and economy. What is happening domestically in its politics? What is happening domestically in its economy? In fact, the first going out of Chinese firms looking for resources and access to resources at source was driven by the nature of the Chinese economy. But I think it's important to point out here that China, in terms of, its foreign policy being driven by what is happening domestically, is not unique. I mean, other countries do the same. We're getting a lot of questions here. We have questions that we wanted to go through, but let's address some of the audience questions, Brad. My colleague Charles Kinney and my colleague Scott Morris recently did a piece in Foreign Affairs in which they argue that I think it's like 3.9% of US aid is actually given to foreign governments to do. Most of it goes to NGOs, it goes to the Beltway bandits, like, implementers of US foreign aid. And there's a question here about how much of the Chinese lending is done directly by states.
You mean how much of the lending is directed government borrowers?
Yeah, G to G, yeah, and then being implemented by governments.
Yeah, so to answer that question, again, you have to distinguish between the BRI period and the pre-BRI period. So most of the lending before the introduction of BRI was to sovereigns. And that's when, a lot of governments went on a Chinese borrowing spree. They took on a lot of debt onto the government balance sheet. And then by the time BRI was announced in late 2013, many of these governments, they just couldn't take that much more debt onto their own balance sheet. And so that kind of put the Chinese state-owned banks in a bit of a bind, right? Because they were being told from the political leadership in China, okay, it's time to ramp up overseas lending, but they had just come out of a period of huge amounts of Chinese lending, a huge ramp up of lending to the developing world. So that really forced the banks to get creative. And what they did was they started redirecting loans not to sovereigns, but to state-owned companies, in state-owned enterprises in the host country, state-owned banks, special purpose vehicles, joint ventures. They sort of worked around the sovereign. The tricky thing is that in the BRI era, 70% of China's lending is going to these entities other than the central government. However, many of the loans that are being issued are still backed by either an explicit or an implicit form of liability protection, right? So you don't really know if these debts are private or public until the project is further into implementation. When you have projects that are in distress, right? Say, perfect example of this is the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. Rather than issuing a $4 billion loan from China Development Bank to the government of Indonesia, they set up a shell company. They set up a special purpose vehicle, and they lent $4 billion to that entity. Now, if the high-speed railway was implemented on time and on budget, there'd be enough revenue coming in from ticket sales to repay the loan. And then it's really not a public sector liability. But the highway is not built, and it's $2 billion over budget. And so the president of Indonesia, when that loan was initially issued, he said, that ain't public debt. We're not on the taxpayers, not on the hook for it. Well, in October, just about 6 months ago, the president of Indonesia issued a new decree authorizing a central government bailout of that off-book special purpose vehicle, right? To keep them sufficiently liquid, right? They're trying to tide them over to help them get the project over the finish line to the point where it starts to generate a revenue stream that can be used to repay the loan. So, the Indonesian president is not going to openly acknowledge that the $275 million that he took from the public treasury and gave to the special purpose vehicle is to repay China, but that's why the special purpose vehicle exists, to repay that loan. So that's one of the risks of this very rapid increase in Chinese lending. Sovereigns can only take on so much, right? And so, the banks, Chinese state-owned banks, are looking for other productive outlets, where they can invest these surplus dollars. But that does not mean it's sort of risk-free for host governments.
Well, and some of them have, like an explicit sovereign guarantee, and in those instances, and so then
that's right.
Eventually, it comes back to haunt and part of this, we see this elsewhere. Where so sometimes in PPP projects for, say, a toll road, there is sometimes a gap when the toll is not able, and the government makes an implicit guarantee to fill that gap. It's just the scale at which the Chinese do it is significantly higher than anything we've seen anywhere else. Is this accurate?
Yeah, that's right. And I think we'll probably come to this a little bit later, but there's soul searching going on in Beijing right now, and we're going to see a reboot. There will be a BRI 2.0, and PPPs might be a big part of that reboot. And this is going to create even bigger public financial management challenges, right? Because a lot of the guarantees that host governments provide for PPPs are not well documented, they're not well understood, right? So instead of guaranteeing the repayment of the debt, maybe now you're going to provide a minimum traffic guarantee, right? So if there aren't enough people using the toll road, the government's going to say, look, we're going to fill the gap. Well, maybe that's not debt strictly defined, but it is a public sector liability, right? And it's sort of easier for host governments to hide the liabilities that are being generated through those PPPs. So this is going to require a lot of continued monitoring and oversight.
Thank you. Again, if you have questions for Brad, please submit them to events@cgdev.org, tweet at cgdev, or the hashtag CGD Talks, or submit your questions and comments via YouTube. I think, Brad, we should pivot now to you know, does China finance white elephants? Is the impact of Chinese lending and Chinese aid significantly less than those of its competitors and peers in the OECD DAC? What are the differences and similarities, especially when it comes to measuring and evaluating impact of China vis-a-vis the West?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, this is an area where, when I tell people about what we find, I say, prepare to check your priors, check your assumptions at the door, because the results are pretty surprising, right? The conventional wisdom is, they, in their zeal to efficiently install the economic hardware of development, right? That, the sort of speed, we get speed, but we get lower quality projects, or these white elephants. And here's what we actually found. We found that Chinese government financed development projects have major impacts on economic growth in the countries and the subnational localities where they take place. Our statistical analysis, what it shows is that the average Chinese development project increases a host country's economic growth rate by 0.95 percentage points, 2 years, just 2 years after the funding for the project is approved. So think about that.
Could you say that again, Brad? Could you say that again?
It shows that the average Chinese development project increases a host country's economic growth rate by just under 1 percentage point, 0.95 percentage points. So what does that imply? Think about this. If you're a host country and you've got a baseline economic growth of, let's say, 2%, right? And you choose to accept 3 additional Chinese development projects, the best statistical evidence that we have suggests that that host government can reasonably expect to increase its rate of economic growth from a baseline of 2% to 4.85% within 2 years of China agreeing to fund the projects. And the other thing that we find is that the impacts, they materialize very quickly within 2 to 5 years, and they are especially strong in one region of the world, and that is Africa. And it's not just about increasing the overall level of economic output. It's, we also find that the BRI-like projects, the ones that involve connective infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, tunnels, what we find is that they also substantially reduce economic inequalities within the districts and the provinces where they take place.
Could you give us a specific example of some of this, Brad? Like, give us a specific example.
Absolutely can. So, I'm going to tell you about the Thika superhighway project in Kenya. But before I do that, I'll just give you kind of the top line finding on inequality is that the implementation of just one additional Chinese government financed transportation infrastructure project generates a 10 percentage point reduction in the concentration of economic activity within the average district in a low-income country or a middle-income country. So I'm going to sort of try to unpack this by sort of helping you understand the intuition of what these connective infrastructure projects are doing. What they're doing is they're spreading economic activity to more remote and disadvantaged areas by building infrastructure that helps local residents and businesses reach more distant markets and reach more distant places of employment. So the Thika superhighway, what is it? It's a 50-kilometer expressway. It runs from downtown Nairobi to a set of satellite towns in peri-urban areas. And its rehabilitation was co-financed by China Exim Bank and the African Development Bank. And if you take remotely sensed nighttime light output from satellite imagery, right, which is often used by economists as a proxy for subnational economic output, and you look at that nighttime light output along the road corridor, the 50-kilometer road corridor, before and after the completion of the project, what you see is that the biggest economic gains that resulted from the rehabilitation of the road, they did not accrue to residents of Nairobi. The biggest beneficiaries were the households living in the satellite towns near the on-ramps and the off-ramps along the linear path of the infrastructure. So who are we talking about? We're talking about basically commuters who travel to and from Nairobi for work. So that's the good news, right? I mean, there's some bad news in the book that also relates to kind of who benefits from these projects, but I think the good news is not trivial.
So on this question of impact, I want to go back to DAC projects. All right. So in the evidence from the book, just so we're clear, is that DAC projects are not necessarily superior in outcomes than China's finance development projects. Is this correct?
That's exactly right. And we sort of look at, we do a benchmarking of Chinese projects versus DAC and multilateral projects kind of on two measures of impact. The first is intended impact, and the other is unintended impact. And essentially what we find is that on the intended impact, meaning socioeconomic impacts of these projects, that the projects financed by DAC donors and multilateral institutions, they either generate similar levels of socioeconomic impact, or in some cases even lower levels of impact than Chinese development projects. But there's a trade-off. These projects financed by DAC and multilateral development finance institutions, they're also less risky, meaning they have fewer unintended impacts on things like environmental degradation, on corruption, on political capture, on debt distress. So this is this tension and trade-off, right, between intended impact and unintended impact. Chinese projects, we show in the book, do really well on intended impact. They don't do very well on unintended impact. We actually find they unfortunately fuel local corruption around the project site. They're subject to political capture, high levels of political capture. They have negative environmental externalities. And so it's a kind of a defining characteristic of China's overseas development program. It's this tension between risk and reward, or efficacy and safety, right? And I think when you're comparing China to its peers tend to do really well on the safety side, and efficacy is a little bit more of a mixed bag. So that's the dilemma, right? That has been kind of thrust upon the authorities. They're being forced to make difficult choices.
I think this is evident in terms of what goes into quality of project selection and project preparation. Whereas on the DAC side, the multilateral side, a significant amount of the social economic impact of the project, and they try to interrogate that as much as is possible. But that also means that the project takes slightly longer to be implemented, right? Whereas on the Chinese side, is there's less of that, but then, like you said, it comes with the risk of unintended consequences on project affected persons.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, I think I think our data set shows that the average average BRI infrastructure projects nowadays takes 2.8 years to implement. If you take a comparable project from the multilaterals, they take 7 or 8 years to implement, right? And these Chinese projects are also generating near-term economic benefits, but the cost, right? The downside is that they are being there's a system that China's put in place to fast track the approval and the implementation of these projects. And that system has some benefits. It also has some drawbacks. And I think some of the big drawbacks are political capture and corruption. So we show, that basically they administer a demand-driven project identification system. So they ask for project proposals and loan applications, not from technocrats, but from politicians, and not any politicians. They ask for the proposals or the loan applications from the office of the president or the prime minister. And the reason why that matters is because it often leads to projects being greenlit that disproportionately benefit the core political supporters of, who do you think? The president or the prime minister, right? So we put a number on it in the book. The average political leader's home province sees a 52% increase in funding from Beijing during the years when he or she is in power. And then that kind of political capture effect, it just vanishes when the leader leaves power. The money goes away when the leader leaves. we also show that in the run-up to elections, politically consequential jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions, see very sharp increases in Chinese government funding. And we find that no bid commercial contracts are being issued to Chinese state-owned enterprises that already have a presence on the ground. And so they've already got the ability to quickly mobilize as soon as a loan application is approved. And Chinese state-owned enterprises and host country politicians, they're the ones responsible for submitting loan applications. And what they've done is they've kind of institutionalized a very simple but effective deception. And the deception is they first inflate the cost of the underlying commercial contract that the loan is going to finance. And then they develop a side agreement to split the extra profits or the illicit proceeds from that commercial contract. And I think this sort of helps explain why the BRI is this kind of lightning rod for controversy, right? On one hand, you've got China's allies and clients, and they're just lavishing praise on Beijing for,
this is the best thing since sliced bread.
Exactly. They're saying, like, you're funding all this hardware that's been neglected by traditional donors and creditors. And that is true. But then on the other hand, you've got China's critics and its rivals, and they're saying, look, these projects have an array of negative side effects.
Yes.
And I think what this book shows is that neither side is entirely right or entirely wrong. Public opinion about the BRI, it's divided because of this fundamental tension between safety and efficacy, or risk and reward, at the heart. It lies at the heart of China's overseas development program. So if I'm a leader in the global South, what's the big takeaway? The big takeaway is, yeah, there's real reward to be reaped here. There's also a risk. The risks of relying upon Beijing as a financier of first resort, they're substantial, but they can be actively managed and mitigated. And that's where you see huge differences across countries. Some countries are really proactively managing and mitigating the risks, and others are not, right? And that really influences the outcomes that we observe on the ground.
There was a question about China's approach, whether China was approaching low and middle income countries, or these countries were approaching China. But you just addressed that. In addressing the risk, I mean, one of the things, Liberia is a really poor country, but one of the examples I've always given is that because we came out of war and our infrastructure was initially designed and done through the World Bank system, we will get a Chinese firm to do the infrastructure and hire a third party, usually a European firm, engineering firm, to supervise the works, which meant you got better quality in terms of the environment, in terms of labor relations, because you had a supervisor who was doing that. But in places where that doesn't happen, you can see that risk. Brad, we have about 7 minutes left, and I wanted us to talk about the future. There has been, at least since 2016, a noticeable decline in Chinese lending and spending elsewhere. We've seen this in Africa. We've seen it everywhere. What is the future of Chinese lending? I mean, over the last, especially between 2013 and say 2017, 2018, a lot of criticism, especially from US government through the State Department and then European counterparts, about the intent of Chinese lending. But they've tried to come up with something. There's B3W, there's Global Gateway. What is the future of these programs? Will they match the BRI? Is the BRI changing into something else? What can we expect? What can you say to us about the future of Chinese lending programs across the world?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Beijing is kind of in a period where they're taking a strategic pause, and there's kind of introspection going on. And there's several reasons why that's the case. I think the first is the BRI project, the infrastructure project portfolio, it's running into major implementation problems: corruption scandals, labor violations, environmental hazards, public protests. So they're dealing with that on one front. They're seeing an increase in project suspensions and cancellations. They're seeing host country policymakers that are starting to distance themselves from China because of changes in public sentiment that are making it difficult to maintain close relations with Beijing. And then on top of that, they got to think about competition in a way that they previously did not, right? So the US and the UK and the other members of the G7 are making a lot of noise about B3W. They're also kind of actively positioning the BRI as the low quality infrastructure option, and B3W and Global Gateway as an alternative kind of higher quality option for countries that want to go down a different path where they're going to pursue infrastructure projects based on, I think they say, transparent and sustainable financing. So all of these things are really forcing the authorities into this period of introspection and thinking about rebooting BRI and kind of relaunching it as BRI 2.0. And, you know, I think as they look ahead to BRI 2.0, there's at least 4 or 5 big questions that they're going to have to tackle. The first is, you know, debt rescheduling, right? They've issued a lot of loans. Many of their borrowers cannot repay their existing debts. So they are at a fork in the road where they have to decide, do we take a go-it-alone approach or a coordinated approach to debt rescheduling? And there's some encouraging signs. You know, historically, they've pursued the go-it-alone approach. There's encouraging but preliminary evidence this week from Zambia that they may be opening. There may be an opening where they're more willing to consider a coordinated approach. Second big question, I think, is whether to embrace bilateral rescue lending or to sort of delegate that to the IMF. So we're starting to see more and more loans, not for projects, but we're starting to see balance of payment lending, liquidity support, right? Either to central banks or to finance ministries that are expressly authorizing the borrower to use the proceeds of these loans to repay old debts, right? To repay old project debts. But I think, you know, as we're seeing right now in real time in Sri Lanka, now, you know, we're the latest reporting suggests they're saying, no, you need to go to the IMF, right, for rescue lending. So I think that's a big decision that they're going to have to take. You know, I think another one is this confidentiality issue. This has just haunted them. It's haunted them, you know, because it's put them on defense. They spent years trying to beat back the debt trap diplomacy narrative, which is just a myth. And a lot of that, you know, the myth could have been easily punctured, right, by being transparent about what is and what is not in their contracts. And then 2 more things, and that is, you know, their instincts are to go to the highest levels of government and cater to the interests of governing elites. But the problem that BRI is now facing is there's public antipathy towards China in 24 or 36 countries around the world. So they have to figure out, like, who are we trying to win over, the general public or governing elites? And then finally, you know, they've made noise about potentially multilateralizing the BRI, which I sort of read as a way to ratchet down some of the risk that is baked into their project identification and approval system, right? So if we now start subjecting projects to ex-ante cost benefit analysis, if we subject projects to international competitive bidding procedures, right? If we use more stringent environmental and social safeguards, right? We can sort of do that by co-financing projects with multilateral institutions and sort of deferring to their due diligence procedures. That's going to slow down project implementation. It's also going to ratchet down risk. And they're seeing risk all over their portfolio right now. So I think that is a major decision. They've got some experiments. They've sort of done some trial balloons. They've given about $2 billion. PBOC has given about $2 billion to the African Development Bank for sort of co-financing. So these are like AFDB implemented projects that are supplemented with funds that the Central Bank of China has delegated to the African Development Bank. So they're sort of AFDB projects all the way through. They're designed and implemented by the AFDB, but supplemented, right, with Chinese government funds. And I think that's now giving them the opportunity to take a portfolio perspective and say, what am I getting for, what kind of bang for buck am I getting for the project I'm financing through the African Development Bank? They're also doing this in the Inter-American Development Bank, as opposed to what I would get if I give another dollar to CDB or I give another dollar to China Exim Bank. So I think that's very much an open question about where the BRI might be heading.
Brad, this has been such an excellent conversation. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to come here to talk to us about the book. I would like to encourage the audience to get a copy of the book, Banking on Beijing, The Aims and Impacts of China's Overseas Development Program. Brad, on behalf of me and my colleagues here at the Center for Global Development, we want to thank you for taking the time to come here this morning. Thanks to all of our listeners and guests and those who joined us. This video is going to be available on our website, on our CGD YouTube channel. You can go back and listen to it, and we'll put in the links of Brad's book. Brad, when is the book available and where can people buy it?
I think you can get it on Amazon right now. It came out on May 5th. So hope folks will buy it and enjoy it.
Yes, please. It's on Amazon. Buy it, enjoy it. Thank you for coming, Brad. Again, thanks for being with us today. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to the CGD team that make this possible. We appreciate it, guys. And have a great day, everyone.